Welcome, everyone. It's good to see this growing turnout here for this vital issue of who rules the academy and how to fight back. I'm Constance Penley. I'll moderate our panel. I am Professor Emerita at UC Santa Barbara and President of the Council of University of California Faculty Associations. We are partnered with AAUP-AFT, and we are a founding member of HELU, Higher Education Labor United. Okay, today, higher education in the US is subject to an unprecedented wave of attacks from external and internal sources. I don't need to tell anyone here that. This panel will identify several of those sources and suggest ways to combat them. Our panelists will address what we might learn from the labor movement about how to resist the finance sector executives who dominate many governing boards, the autocratic legal form of the American Academy and how it might be reconstituted, and the panel will take up the failure of strategies aimed at securing compromise solutions with the university's rulers, as well as what we should demand now. So welcome to, again, to the just a tremendous turnout here. This is wonderful. We do believe that this is a fundamental issue that we need to address no matter what our particular sectors of this struggle that we are working on. So we are going to, I'm going to just briefly introduce our panelists. And then they will be speaking in this order. Timothy Kaufman-Osborn is Professor Emeritus at Whitman College and the author of The Autocratic Academy, Re-envisioning Rule Within America's Universities. That is, he wrote the book on today's topic. Amy Offner is an associate professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania and president of AAUP Penn. Chris Newfield is Distinguished Professor Emeritus at UC Santa Barbara and Director of Research at the Independent Social Research Foundation in London. Now, each panelist will speak for 12 minutes in that order, and we will aim very hard to have 15 minutes at the end for questions from the audience and final thoughts. And you will be putting your questions in the Q&A. The chat is disabled for this time. So let's get started. Tim, will you start us off, please?
Sure, and thank you, Constance. Before I begin my formal remarks, I want to express my gratitude to those who have organized the events for this day of action. It's one of the more remarkable groups that I've ever had the privilege of working with, and I think all of us are in their debt. So today what I want to do is offer 4 propositions about the situation we confront today. Woven together, I think those 4 propositions hint at a broader argument that I won't be able to develop now, but will be happy to expand on later, time permitting. And my hope is that these 4 propositions will provide a useful context for the remarks of Amy and Chris. So proposition number 1. The threat posed to U.S. colleges and universities today is quite literally an existential threat. And to some, that claim may sound hyperbolic. It's not. A coordinated right-wing assault on higher education has been underway for half a century now, and its origins can be traced back at least as far as Ronald Reagan's election in 1980. More recently, this campaign has assumed more aggressive form as multiple state legislatures have amplified the precarity of the instructional workforce, eliminated programs that challenge racialized, gendered, and other forms of inequality, imposed gag orders on what faculty can and cannot say in the classroom, and much more. The state of Florida is the prototype of this campaign to employ governmental power to secure control over higher education. But as we all know, this assault has now spread to many other states throughout the nation. What I think we've seen in the second Trump administration is an emboldened deployment of the federal government's power to advance this right-wing project. And the exemplar here, I think the obvious exemplar is Colombia, where after impounding $400 million in funding, the federal government demanded that Colombia overhaul its admission system, adopt an expansive definition of what counts as anti-Semitism, empower Colombia's security officers to arrest so-called agitators, to place specific academic departments under external control, and much more. And again, as we all know, on March 21st, Colombia's Board of Trustees and President acceded to most of these imperatives. And in my view, that surrender is the act that identifies the American Academy's situation at this moment in time. The larger lesson I think that we should draw from this abbreviated history is this. The political right now seeks to strip the American Academy of its autonomy and hence its capacity for self-governance by rendering colleges and universities subject to state control on behalf of authoritarian ends. This, I think, is what Florida's attorneys clearly told us when, in defending the law colloquially known as Stop Woke, the attorneys declared that the university is merely an administrative unit of the state, and its instructional employees are, I quote, that unit's mouthpieces. Should that construction come to prevail, what we call academic freedom will no longer exist, and what we call universities will no longer be worthy of that name. And that, in short, is what I mean when I contend that the contemporary threat to higher education is indeed existential in nature. Proposition number 2, we cannot assume that those who rule U.S. colleges and universities will defend the cause of higher education against this existential threat. As evidence for the second proposition, I would cite the failure of all but a very few university presidents and governing boards to fight back against this threat. That deplorable fact cannot be explained merely by citing the cowardice of the Academy's rulers. There is, I believe, a deeper structural cause at work here. We like to think of our universities as central to the vitality of our democracy, and hence as sources of resistance to creeping authoritarianism. But I think that article of faith proves problematic when we recognize that America's colleges and universities are themselves legally organized as autocracies. And if that is so, then their structure of rule does more to replicate than to repudiate the authoritarian order that now seeks to reduce institutions of higher education to the status of compliant subjects. To see the point, in your mind's eye, conjure up a picture of the typical organizational chart of any American college or university, or alternatively, take a look at the charter, the Constitution, or the enabling statute that dictates how the power to rule is distributed at the institution that now employs each of us. What one finds at the top of these hierarchically structured entities are governing boards, whether called trustees, regents, or whatever. The Academy's fundamental powers of governance are located by law within these bodies, and these powers include the authority to appoint, as well as to dismiss the presidents, whose foremost duty is to do the bidding of their superiors. Beneath these boards and presidents, we find everyone else, whether designated as faculty or staff. What renders the legal form of the American Academy essentially autocratic is the structural exclusion of those subject to its rulers from any legally guaranteed title to participate in the exercise of rule. In our capacity as employees, in other words, we're defined by our lack of any enforceable right to make the rules by which we are governed or to select and hold accountable those who rule over us. True, we may sometimes pass resolutions of no confidence in our rulers, but because those resolutions in the last analysis have no binding force, I believe that they testify not to our collective power, but to our status as subordinates whose fate is ultimately determined by others. Proposition number 3, As we seek to contest the Academy's incorporation within an authoritarian regime, I think we need to think very carefully and strategically about the tools available to us for that purpose. Think, for example, of the idea of shared governance. At those colleges and universities where shared governance has not already been gutted, appeals framed in this vernacular can sometimes provide faculty a voice, as is the case, for example, in faculty senates. But the fact remains that the power exercised by these representative bodies is always subject to constriction or even abolition, whether by governing boards and or in public institutions by state legislatures. To grant this is not to suggest that we should abandon entirely appeals framed in the language of shared governance, but it is to say that these appeals will remain inadequate as vehicles of faculty empowerment so long as the legal form of the American Academy remains essentially autocratic. For a second tool of resistance, think of unionization and collective bargaining. True, unions can push for better working conditions, higher wages, and due process protections against the worst excesses of arbitrary rule. Equally, if not more important, unions can organize faculty struggles to withhold the power that the university cannot do without. That's the power of our labor. That said, it remains true that unions operate within the confines of an anti-democratic institutional structure, and for that reason, unionization is a strategic tool that can accomplish many things, but not everything. In the last analysis, each of these two tactics, shared governance and unionization, represent strategies of accommodation insofar as they accept as a given the Academy's autocratic legal structure. That structure is a contingent relic of colonial America that was first adopted not to ensure realization of the Academy's educational mission, but instead to guarantee the ongoing control of our earliest colleges by political, economic, and clerical elites. Until we question this anachronism, our universities will continue to be ruled by governing boards whose members are unequipped and often indisposed to safeguard the distinctive work of the Academy. To plead with these bodies or their executive appointees, to plead with them to save us from the likes of Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump is not to affirm the cause of self-governance. Rather, it's to acknowledge our dependence on those who enjoy the powers we ourselves are denied. Fourth and final proposition. Our choice of strategies today must be informed, I believe, by an ideal of what we believe the American Academy should be and must become if it is to sustain the fragile good we call free inquiry. Because today's onslaught against U.S. higher education is so aggressive, I worry that we are lapsing into a defensive crouch where our only aim is to safeguard what we have not yet lost. And I worry that we may seek to defend institutionalized arrangements that are deeply problematic, whether that be higher education's current dependence on federal and state funding, or the ways we now seek to accomplish the goals of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Yes, of course, we must do what we can to resist governmental encroachments on higher education, but I think we also need to nurture our collective capacity to imagine a very different university than the one we inhabit today. As we consider possible futures, I would suggest that our inquiry be informed by two basic principles that must be realized if free inquiry is to remain, in fact, free. First, the American Academy must be sufficiently autonomous to ward off intruders who would betray its proper end. And second, the American Academy must be self-governing in the sense that those who do its work must enjoy the capacity to determine how the university's end is to be accomplished. Autonomy and self-governance, I'm arguing, are the watchwords that should inform our struggles and strategies in the days to come. And that's especially so since today, these are precisely the two conditions that the right-wing assault on U.S. higher education now seeks to eliminate. Let me close quickly with this. In 1913, a scholar whose name we do not know declared that it is self-contradictory and indeed dangerous to believe that a nation can remain democratic if its universities are organized autocratically. In response, another scholar asked how the American Academy might be reconstituted, I quote, as a democracy of scholars serving the larger democracy of which it is a part. And that I would submit is not a bad way to frame our task today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Autonomy and self-governance. We will now go to Amy Offner for some brief remarks.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here, and I really am thrilled to be hearing from the other speakers. I think there's probably no more important thing to do than to politicize the deeply anti-democratic forms of governance and rule that are root problems for everything that we're facing in higher ed right now. And I want to say that I guess I'm a little bit different from the other two speakers here in that this is not actually what I study, and I'm probably not the best person to discuss it. And so what I'm going to be talking about today comes from a little bit of reading from my experience talking with and trying to learn from other people in the labor movement. And what I want to talk about is what we can learn about how to confront the kinds of corporate executives who sit on boards of trustees at universities today, what we can learn from the strategies that the labor movement more broadly has used in confronting those same corporate executives and the sectors of capital that they represent. So I want to start by just thinking about who sits on university boards. So at the University of Pennsylvania, where I am, and at many other universities, the trustees are chiefly executives from the financial sector, and many of them are particularly private equity and hedge fund managers. Charlie Eaton, who's a sociologist, has looked at billionaires listed in the Forbes 400, and he finds that among that group, private equity and hedge fund managers are more than twice as likely as the others to serve on the boards, especially of elite universities. Executives from private equity and hedge funds are really attracted to prestige. They also tend to come from elite universities. That's where they're educated. And because the managers in these firms are so highly paid, they are the big donors. And being a big donor is, of course, what gets you a seat on the board of trustees. So what do hedge fund and private equity managers use universities and board memberships for? How does higher education fit into their business strategies? Universities are for them partly tax shelters. These are people who make large tax-deductible donations, and then that money goes into university endowments, which are then reinvested in their sector. They're reinvested in private equity, in hedge funds. So there's a very kind of basic way in which universities, as tax-exempt places to park your capital, and as large institutional investors that go back into private equity, serve these board members. The other thing that university board membership does for these executives is it provides them with social connections that can be very important to their business activities. Charlie Eaton, the same sociologist who I mentioned before, he's done interesting research on this, and he argues, and these are his words, he argues that private equity firms attained higher investment returns when their general partners held more trustee positions on university boards. And he suggests that this may be because private equity and hedge funds are intrinsically, what they're trying to do is outperform public markets. And one of the ways that they can try to do that is by having access to private information that helps them choose investments. And how do you get access to private investment? Fundamentally, that's about having social relationships, relationships of trust with other corporate executives. And that is exactly what being on the board of trustees of a university does. Serving on those boards is one of the ways that social networks are created among very rich university alumni. It's a capitalist class formation exercise, and those relationships can provide access to private information. So Eaton argues that this might explain why private equity firms whose general partners serve as trustees on more university boards also have higher investment returns. So the basic point here is that when we look at our boards of trustees, we're very often looking at these, private equity and hedge fund managers for whom board service is a very functional and useful part of their business activities. That's what the university is for them. Now, of course, higher ed workers are not the first group of workers to find ourselves up against executives from these sections of the financial sector. Private equity, infamously over decades, has bought up all sorts of workplaces in the United States and has restructured them. And so, we can think about hospitals, nursing homes, casinos, hotels, and so forth. And unions in those sectors have decades of experience fighting exactly these firms. When workers are trying to organize a union at a nursing home or at a hotel, the ownership structure is such that very often the owner is actually a private equity fund, and that's ultimately who they're fighting with. So what I want to talk about is what we can learn from the workers and the unions that have run successful organizing drives and contract campaigns, and more or less had very direct fights with the finance sector executives who sit on our university boards. And I think that that's useful for us to think about for two reasons. First is the simple fact that we should always remember that there are opportunities for solidarity. When we are dealing with a private equity manager who is attacking us, we are not alone. It's really valuable to kind of see who else is already running a campaign against their company, and if there are opportunities to work together and support each other. Beyond that simple opportunity for solidarity, I want to kind of think about what we can learn from the recent history of the labor movement and what kinds of pressures these finance sector executives respond to, what kinds of leverage workers have with them. And there are, I think, two basic forms of power and leverage. First are just the most basic forms of collective power that workers have, most importantly, strike power. I won't go on about that, but it's probably the most important lesson to us. And second, and I'll talk more about this because it's a little bit more obscure, is the use of capital strategies. And I want to say at the outset that I'm putting this out for discussion, and I want to try to highlight both the potentially useful applications of capital strategies and also some of the risks and problems that they can present for workers. To understand capital strategies, it helps to think about the nature of private equity and hedge funds and the kinds of pressures that they are intrinsically susceptible to. So who are the investors in a hedge fund or in a private equity fund? They are all very large investors. So they're extremely wealthy individuals, university endowments, and most importantly, by far, most importantly, it's public pension funds, which control, billions of dollars in the US economy. So what I mean here is like the Utah state retirement system and so on and so forth, all around the country, every state. Who are the retirees? Who are the beneficiaries? And in these public pension funds, whose retirement money is this? It's public sector workers in every state, people like teachers who are union members. And these public pension funds have boards of trustees, and among their trustees are retirees. So, retired teachers and other retired public sector workers who are themselves union members, and who can be very sympathetic and can be activated and educated to put pressure on the private equity funds or the hedge funds that those public pensions are invested in. So one of the levers that labor has potentially in dealing with these sectors of capital and private equity, hedge funds, is to figure out which public pension funds are the investors in them, and then to reach out, working with your union, kind of reach out to the trustees of that public pension fund, get them activated to reach out to the private equity fund and put pressure on them and say, we do not like what you're doing. We're your investors, knock it off. So these kinds of strategies have been used, for instance, to support union organizing drives in the United States. As I'm sure everybody here knows, when workers try to organize a union in this country, employers launch incredibly aggressive anti-union campaigns that would be illegal in many other countries. And one of the things they try to do is drag out the organizing drive for many years to demoralize and intimidate the workers. And there are unions in the US that have found that when they are organizing a workplace where the owner is actually a private equity firm, the key is often to, first of all, you've got to run a strong organizing drive, just like you would in any context. And then you combine it with capital strategies to get those public pension funds to put pressure on the firm using their status as large institutional investors. And when you combine those two things, when you use the capital strategies, organizing drives that used to take like years to win can be won in 6 months. So these are strategies that can actually help build worker power in that way. There are also some problems with using these kinds of capital strategies. Public pension funds are governed by incredibly restrictive and myopic conceptions of fiduciary duty. They cannot get up and say to a private equity fund, we are against union busting. It is unjust. We are against your attacks on academic freedom because we believe in open inquiry as necessary to higher education for the public good. Those are not arguments that they can make, actually. The only arguments that they can make are extremely narrow and instrumental ones about protecting the value of their retirement fund. So they can say, hey, private equity manager, we see that you're spending all your time attacking academic freedom in the United States. Are you even doing your job? We are concerned that you're putting our retirement investments at risk. That's the sort of pressure that they can put. One of the things you can see from this is that on their face, these are very limited grounds on which to press these finance sector executives. And beyond that, the use of this strategy has the effect of reinforcing the principle of shareholder primacy. It involves workers exercising power as shareholders, mobilizing the specific type of power that comes from labor's ownership of these big pools of capital that are public pension funds. And in the big picture, the principle of shareholder primacy is not good for workers or for working class power in the United States. So in the big picture, it would be much better to have, for all of us to have a retirement system in the United States that was basically a much expanded Social Security system, a pay-as-you-go system, not systems like these either private or state pension funds that depend on accumulating these huge pools of capital that then pension fund trustees hand over to asset management firms to invest in ways that generally undermine the interests of workers. Given that that is the structure of the US retirement system, given that there are these big pools of capital, this is a tool that's available. It can be useful, but it's, I think, very important to think about it critically with, I would suggest, kind of two principles in mind. First is the fact that we should never think about capital strategies as a substitute for building organized power. The best uses of capital strategies have been those that I mentioned before, the ones that support organizing drives and campaigns. Everything has to be oriented to how are you building membership? How are you building the power of workers to exercise collective power as workers, not as investors? And so, that is exercising power through the capacity for direct action, industrial action, political action, not by leaning into the principle of shareholder primacy. And the second principle to think about is that we should always be in pursuit of the much broader goal of building a more just retirement system in the United States that would effectively do a lot to take the funding and power away from these large private equity and hedge funds. So I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to hearing Chris's comments.
That was great. Yeah, thanks both of you. This is going to be a really interesting discussion afterwards. My talk is called Popularity of Thinking, and it's going to be a series of propositions also. One, the first necessary step has been taken, which is university lawfare against the Trump administration. I mean, this recognizes that the Trump regime are not reformers of higher ed, but are its destroyers. And here I'm just echoing what Tim said at the start. I mean, this increasingly obvious fact has a hard implication, which is that the Trump administration is an enemy to be defeated, not a counterparty to be bargained with. And an organization that I think saw this early on has been the AAUP, which rapidly went to court. And I can't really overstate how impressed I am both by the national organization, by so many of its individual chapters, Penn, Rutgers, its partner, KUKFA at the University of California, that Connie represents, multiple unions, HELU, very much a sort of an umbrella organization organizing that, and many other staff and faculty organizations. So I mean, the first thing I'd say is that you all have done great work at getting inside the high-speed operating loop of the Trump people and at being appropriately adversarial. And so I think there's a real chance that we're going to win on many fronts if we keep fighting, hammer and tongs. And that seems very much to have been engaged now. Two, higher ed must work with Democrats, with the Democratic Party, but must not be led by them. And the reason is that the Democratic Party has repeatedly failed to articulate the purposes and the political economy of higher education. The result is that Democrats see themselves as the natural party of education. They get the votes of most college graduates, while misselling what higher ed is and therefore not convincing the wider electorate of its value. And an example of this, or evidence for this, is comes from the most painful chart that I've recently seen from Democratic pollster David Shore via Ezra Klein. I'm going to do a screen share. Of that chart. And what you see is that voters trusting Republicans more than Democrats on really most things. More important issues are on the right rather than the left, according to the polled people. And issues that favor Republicans are lower down and Democrats higher up. I've circled the two issues that we're here to talk about today. I mean, amazingly, the allegedly Democratic issues of education and student debt are actually in a toss-up with the Republicans. I mean, voters apparently don't really know whether the Republicans who want to eliminate the Department of Education that administers financial aid, including Pell Grants, or that wants to give student loans back to private banks are maybe better for education than Democrats. I would suggest that voters are confused in large part because mainstream Democrats have no strongly anti-Republican positions on college. Democrats aren't really for free college. I mean, that's Bernie Sanders still out there more or less on his own in the political world. Democrats aren't really for debt cancellation. Democrats aren't really for full public funding of regional colleges so working class people get really high quality degrees. Democrats are for college as job training, just like Republicans are. Democrats have one idea about college, which is that it's tuition-based vocational training with some means testing, but high net costs for college are okay. I mean, this is Governor Newsom in California, Kamala Harris as a presidential candidate, et cetera. I mean, they sell us out as job training and they still can't get non-college voters. So Democrats are bad on advancing strong higher education for the basic reason that they don't listen to educators. And my conclusion on that is that educators now need to lead ourselves and hope that Democrats come along eventually. 3, anti-intellectualism is always pervasive in America, and yet it is not popular in America. The Democrats aren't convincing people to vote big for great public colleges, not because college is too intellectual in their descriptions of it, but because the Democratic version isn't intellectual enough. Republicans are the enemies of popular thinking, everyday study, affordable intellectuality. But as I've just suggested, so are tag-along, job-fixated mainstream Democrats. Governor Newsom had the right-wing woke hater Charlie Kirk on his podcast last month. And when Kirk mocked students who major in North African lesbian poetry, the Democratic education governor laughed right along with him. Meanwhile, the proverbial jobs of the future require more education, not less, across all disciplines, especially in the humanities, arts, and social sciences, including in North African lesbian poetry. The Democrats are screwing up even their vocational issue without offering an alternative. 4, higher ed's story, freed from the Democratic Party, must center on popular intellectuality, popular thinking, thinking as popular, thinking for all. College has a core role in this sense. College helps you think so you can have the life you want. College doesn't help you adapt to this modern world by learning to use AI so it can think for you. College doesn't mainly help you meet important people and make new friends. College doesn't mainly give you practical workplace skills. College helps you think so you can have the life you want. You may think that's a weak bumper sticker, and it certainly does need work, but it's a hell of a lot better than any college bumper stickers that political parties or university presidents are selling right now. So we must stress as part of this the non-pecuniary benefits and the public benefits of learning as much as the private benefits. But the re-narration of college has to start with helping everybody of all backgrounds, working class, immigrant, racialized, boringly middle class, queer, everybody, build the personal life that you want, not the life mapped out for you by your family, your neighborhood, your background, but the one imagined and then given to you by you. So here's why we don't ban books, but why we read them. College helps you think so you can have the life you want. Okay, my next 2 points are a package, and I'm going to raise a tricky issue and sound elitist, but I'm going to argue that my claims are actually anti-elitist in the very process of sounding not that. Okay, 5. Higher education is being crushed both by propaganda-based Republican hate and by its twin, a widespread knowledge crisis among US voters. Because this chart that we're still looking at shows this. Many, if not a majority of American voters are profoundly mistaken, wrong, misguided, or ignorant about political and social realities and causal connections between policies and those realities, very much including education. And I would point out that the cost of living, the economy, and inflation have just been proven to not be the Republican strengths that people incorrectly assumed when they were voting for Trump. There's another chart that I think is worth looking at, which is that we actually do have polling evidence that the misinformed voter voted Trump and the get the answer right crowd voted for Kamala Harris. And I'll just let you look at that while I carry on. I mean, there's 4 questions, and whether you were right or wrong had a very strong correlation with the direction in which you voted, and the gap between these 2 is remarkable. So I was saying before that the Democrats have a lot of weak positions that don't resonate with voters. I mean, they were bad at taking inflation seriously, and Harris dropped the anti-corporate policies that are actually popular with voters, even of both parties. But many, many voters, I mean, this is the complementary problem, also can't correctly describe reality and then pick the policy and the candidate that correlates with the outcome that they want. So hence the term knowledge crisis, which is being exploited politically. Okay, now the companion proposition 6. Higher education has to present itself in this crisis as the solution to what I'm going to call American wrongness. And this is going to involve a few things. So I'm going to, let me stop the share. Sorry, I'm having trouble with the cursor. There we go. Okay, I've mentioned one of the things that has to happen with this, which is redefining college as the key to thinking that helps people have the lives they want. Second is the creation of an ethical framework around the duty to think. I mean, nobody has the right not to bother to figure out whether a president really can engage in summary deportations and maybe not follow court orders to fix obvious mistakes. Shrugging about this and staying confused or unsure is an unethical position, as much for bystanders as for government agents of the policy. Tens of millions of people are indeed not bothering to think about this kind of Trumpian despotism, or about the destruction of US university finances, or of scientific and humanities research, or about the destruction of academic freedom. Not thinking is a major reason why illegal, unjust, and destructive things keep happening. Voters have no right not to think about them. Educators must figure out encouraging ways to take a stand on this, and we must do this at a time when we have been largely brainwashed into thinking that it is elitist to expect US voters to be intelligent and to take responsibility for their mistakes. It is not elitist. It is actually a matter of survival. I'm saying that the university must frame an existential duty to know. Zuckerberg has the duty to know how his products damage thinking, politics, and mental health. Bezos has the duty to know that the Donald Trump who would outlaw trans people and refugees would also kill trade with tariffs. A small majority of voters doesn't get to be wrong again and again and again, and that get all mad and hostile when people point that out. They do this anger-based deflection, but they have no right. And they do have a duty, on the other hand, to know about the real consequences of how they think. Universities, professors, students, everyone have the duty to lay out a large national narrative about this duty to know. Okay, 7. And this is something that is really my bread and butter, but I'm actually not gonna give you any visuals on this. 7 is make the full ask for all of the material conditions that will allow popular intellectuality to spread. We actually do know what these are, and I'm just gonna recite the names. A, free public college. The goal is debt-free for all, and free tuition is the most efficient means to do this. B, student debt cancellation. This has to be brought back on the national agenda. C, programs enabling full inclusion and racial and radical diversity, full and defiant support for anti-discrimination measures leading to racial equality within colleges and universities. D, tenure track jobs for all instructors who want them. E, tenure for staff, by which I mean the replacement of at-will with just cause employment for the staff of our colleges and universities. F, the full support of research costs for all fields, arts, social sciences, and humanities, as much as STEM, at all types of colleges, very much including community colleges. And I just say as an aside, Trump's cuts to indirect cost recovery rates and his deletion of many existing STEM grants could end up zeroing out institutional funding for the humanities and arts. This must not be allowed to happen. And G, full academic freedom, which starts with the financial means to allow bottom-up, faculty-controlled collaborative design, not dictated by austerity and consultants, of new era college curricula that fit current conditions. And H, the democratization of university governance, which Tim was talking about, to allow the previous elements to be created over time. And this is going to involve abolishing the governing boards that Amy was telling us about how to influence, perhaps by converting them into powerless figureheads, something like the Danish monarchy. So yes, I do have budget slides to show how to pay for all of this, but luckily for you, I'm out of time. The fight for higher ed, the fight for knowledge, and the fight for popular thinking is on the front lines of this battle for knowledge, justice, and democracy as indivisible issues, which means, Proposition 8, that we have to start planning for the building of the underground university that many of us may end up doing our best work in. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I can't believe it. Everybody's like on time. And we have time for some questions. I think that the one question, which is a practical question that we have now, is someone would like to be able to know where they could get your slides, Chris. So I think you might have them posted on your blog. So do you want to just?
Yeah, I'm going to put this, yes. And I would love to post the whole panel there if you all are willing to do some version of that. So if there's a mailing list for the folks that signed up for this, I can just send the links out. Or I'll send them to you or to Gwen and send them out.
Okay, so I am not seeing, I'm not seeing any question. Oh, here. Okay, here is, yes, questions. Okay, I am going to just, okay. This is a question about, I'm going to take this question from Max Fishman. How can students, especially those like me, so students, who are organizing around anti-war, queer, and immigrant issues, come together with faculty and staff to democratize, unionize, and politically re-narrativize higher education? Great question from a student.
I'm happy to dive in on this. I think that this is a really important time for, coalition building on our campuses. It's important to recognize, first of all, that students are often student workers and can, in that respect, be part of labor coalitions that should be, like Helu says, wall to wall, coast to coast. And one of the things that I've definitely seen happen at Penn with the growth, especially over the last 5 years, of a lot of new union organizing. We've had actually 5 successful union drives on our campus, and that included The grad workers finally successfully won their union, and also undergraduate resident advisors. So different groups of student workers won unions. And one of the things that came from working together was actually a recognition among many students of the structural powerlessness of faculty, actually, that we share a lot within the university because of exactly what Tim and Chris have been talking about. And it's created a lot of great opportunities actually for working together. So at Penn, for instance, we've got a coalition of unions. We work together formulating shared demands of the administration. We support each other in organizing drives, contract campaigns. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there. Of course, there are also student organizations that are not unions and that are organized around, many other issues. And I think that having kind of the conception of labor as representing broad interests, that all of us who are members of unions have cares that extend far beyond the bread and butter issues, but into all the questions of social justice that you're addressing. I think that this is just a time for coalition building. So I would, reach out to the organizations that exist on your campus and tell them what you're working on, and ask about, what they're working on, and see if there are ways to start building, strength in numbers.
Thank you. And we have another question that was asked earlier from Jessica that I think Amy answered, but let's just ask it again. What is their ultimate goal? The ultimate goal, I suppose, of the boards of trustees, to make universities agents and mouthpieces of the state? Or is it to profit off of public learning institutions?
Tim, do you want to start on this?
Yeah, any of you could take that. Like, what's their motives?
I'm always hesitant to speak about motives because I can't get inside the minds of governing board members. But it does seem to me that the options that are posed in that question are not mutually exclusive, right? It's entirely possible to be committed to profiting off of investments in the way that Amy suggested. And at the same time, for example, to be wedded to the incorporation of the university within an authoritarian regime. What we know from authoritarian regimes in the past, from their playbooks, is that they need to defang, disempower, or destroy the primary institutional sectors within civil society that might threaten them or undermine their ultimate ambitions. And we're seeing this with the Trump administration as it goes after higher education, after the press, and after the lawyers. So again, I don't think those are mutually exclusive options that are posed by the questioner.
I completely agree. I do think that there's, there's what I described of the ways in which, for trustees who come from these sectors of finance capital, universities are functional parts of their processes of capital accumulation. It is also the case, and I can only speak about, the Board of Trustees at Penn and also the members of the kind of boards of advisors of the schools at Penn, that the ones who have been most public and active over the last couple of years in attacking faculty, staff, and students, attacking academic freedom, attacking the right to assemble and protest, attacking the ability to really be a university. They are also part of what I see as a political attempt to roll back the gains of the civil rights movement and all of the social movements in the United States since the 1960s. And they've been engaged in that kind of a fight for a long time. They've wanted to destroy affirmative action for many years, and they've, found wedge issues, and they found opportunities to sort of attack universities pretty successfully, unfortunately, especially in the last couple of years. But they're both, they're motivated politically. They have worldviews that to them are, fully fleshed out political and ethical worldviews. And they also have their business activities, and they really dovetail in the way that they interact with the university.
If I may, just one other quick point of PS. I think one of the most important things that students can do, student newspapers in particular, and can do this in conjunction with faculty, is to expose boards, bring them into the sphere of visibility. If you look at what has happened at Columbia and Harvard, in particular the last couple of weeks, you hear very little discussion about governing boards. What the focus has been upon the presidents, and the presidents are ultimately legal agents of the board. So I think precisely what Amy was doing in her remarks, right, to show not merely how governing boards are legally invested with the power of final authority, but how they are also invested in certain capital sectors and their reproduction is something that students can make a significant contribution to.
Yeah, I'd also want to say that universities are centers of cultural power that challenges political and financial power. And this, I mean, this has always been the case. So this is one of the issues that in the 60s, and I mean, Democrats are very uneasy with this also. For example, Democrats didn't like the autonomy of student views around Palestine, pro-Palestinian students, and critiques of U.S. relationship to Israel's policy in the occupied Palestinian territories, et cetera. And you know, this specter of well-educated people building an alternative power center to the ones that are established through finance and government has never been popular with those people. So I mean, I think we should experience the powerfulness of the positions that students have taken in particular, and the tremendous courage of protesters, and use that as a model for how other folks, you know, staff and faculty can conduct ourselves in relation to more powerful people in a very intimidating situation. They've, I think, really shown us the way.
Thank you all for that. We have many questions that are what is to be done questions that are about what specific strategies for moving forward emerge from the analyses of the problems of university governance that you all have so beautifully laid out. So Charmaine Shua, for example, asked, she says she really appreciated Amy's insight that capital pension strategies are most useful when they dovetail with an campaign or drive. Okay, so Charmaine would like to know from any of you, do you have any concrete examples of this? You know, have you seen useful ways that divestment or pension strategies have been mobilized to grow the power of faculty or unions?
Yeah, sure. I can basically refer you what other people have written about this. There's Sanford Jacoby's book, Labor in the Age of Finance, which talks actually about kind of the history of these kind of labor's capital strategies. And I'm happy to talk with you outside of this. Because I'm not sure if there are journalists here, I have to admit, I had kind of a lot of my knowledge of this comes from people in the labor movement, and I asked them what I could and couldn't say here. And I can follow up with you after this to talk with you more about specific examples.
I'd also say the climate movement has been very effective in getting people to think about investment structures and how they're inhibiting the university's ability to do climate leadership. So that seems also like a way into thinking about the other financial issues that Amy was bringing up. I would, I also think that we can talk about our core competencies, which is teaching, learning, and doing research, and the aspects of that that are meaningful to us. And I think that's something that students and professors can work on together. What actually happens in the classroom, debunking the absurd, parodic descriptions of universities that have circulated really effectively through Charlie Kirk and Chris Rufo and the other folks that have made massive businesses out of misrepresenting what happens in teaching and learning and research. So it feels to me like a side of activism there is just, it doesn't mean that we need to move outside of where the things that we understand the best. It just means narrating, explicating, and circulating the experiences that we're having on a day-to-day basis in our workplaces as teachers or students or staff.
Okay, thank you. Other questions that are about specific strategies, for example, around debt and organizing around debt. And there I would refer people to other panels that are going on today for some more specific examples about that, like such as the one organized by the Debt Collective. This is an interesting question from Chad Lavin, who is concerned about the corruption of the university. In other words, when we're talking about the university or the faculty, and we just assume that the university and the faculty are on the right side of this fight. But what about the many policies and practices that are threats to the university that come from within the universities, from schools of management and conservative legal studies to even fields within the liberal arts? So is it possible to defend the university as a whole as if these forces do not exist within the university? And this panel indeed promised that it was going to look at the external and internal forces that are preventing us from democratizing the academy. So you might have, I know you've written about this a good deal.
Sorry, Connie, you broke up for me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, what you do not want to get on a national Zoom call is an unstable internet message. So sorry about that. Okay, so this is Chad Lavin's question.
Oh, I heard that. Who are you asking?
Okay. Okay, so I was just going to point to you first, Chris, because I know you've written a great deal about this.
Yeah. Well, it's a two-front war, and the change in the public understanding has to go up through the folks that control currently the public understanding of that. And one of the parties, I mean, there's Charlie Kirk et al., but internally, it's the boards of governors and senior managers of institutions, and they need to be brought into a grassroots discourse that, under the terms of sort of the neoliberal bargain that we've all been living under for the last 40 years, they've been able to ignore. They've developed other external power bases and have not really had to deal with their communities. And that has to change. There have been real successes around this in the past. And the biggest one that I participated in California was the anti-tuition hike student movement that, for some faculty at least, were also working with the students on. Students have a lot of power with the media. People feel badly about how today's students have been treated in a way they don't feel badly for faculty or staff. And the protests in 2009, 2011, and 2014 essentially eliminated tuition hikes for resident students in the state of California, more or less in perpetuity. I mean, they've never really come back. So that's, I think, an example of working on the inside against one's own senior brass in relation to public understanding of what is actually happening to students, that ends up completely changing a situation in which everybody just thought tuition was going to keep going up for the next 20 or 30 years, and that's how we were going to solve our funding problem. So we can do that again. It's just going to be on a different constellation of issues.
Right. Thank you all so much. And also thank our audience. We just really appreciated the tremendous turnout here for this fundamental issue of who rules the academy and what we can do about it. Thank you. We will try to make what went on here as available as possible to everybody, and have the rest of your good day of your National Day of Action.
Yeah. Thanks, you all.